Today's episode is about a family who immigrated from Ireland to Canada. They were running from the Great Famine, hoping to plant seeds in the land of opportunity. But where they settled, near what we now know as London, Ontario, would soon become the scene to one of the most shocking displays of conspiracy, corruption, and violence that still to this day stain the pages of Canadian history. This is the story of the Black Donnellys. Let's first address the elephant in the room. Why were they called the Black Donnellys? Their skin color, they weren't black, they were white. But the reason that they were called the Black Donnellys is because people believed that their family had a bad reputation, or maybe even that they were cursed. And after hearing today's story, maybe you'll agree that the Donnellys were cursed, because some really awful stuff is about to happen. James and his wife, Johanna, they immigrated from Ireland to Canada in about 1844 with their oldest son, James Jr. This trip would have been awful, by the way. They were fleeing the Great Famine in Ireland, which officially began in 1845, and really what the Great Famine meant is that there's not enough food. Not enough doctors, and so people started dying out in the streets, and it was really awful. But this trip represented maybe a new opportunity, a way for them to start over. And again, it was not easy. They would have had to leave Ireland, most likely headed to Liverpool, England, where they would have got on a rickety old boat, taken that on about a 6-week journey across the Atlantic Ocean, landing in eventually either Quebec City or Montreal, Canada. After that, they would have traveled up the St. Lawrence River and eventually made their way to a town near what we now know as London, Ontario. You see, London today has a major highway going through there called the 401. There's retail shopping centers, restaurants, universities, and a lot of people. Back then, however, it was like the wild, wild west. You had churches, you had schools, maybe a few taverns, and a lot of men with axes and tempers to grind. So James and his wife Joanna, along with little James, they eventually found a piece of land near London, Ontario. Now again, this was not like we know it today. It's not like they go to realtor.com and type in land for sale. So eventually they just found a piece of land that seemingly was unoccupied, and they started living there. They built a wooden cabin. They started tending to the fields, so that would have meant removing trees, removing rocks, tilling the soil, and even, of course, planting seeds. Speaking of planting seeds, they also had about another 7 kids. So, for all intents and purposes, the Donnellys had actually made a really nice life for themselves. But that all changed when someone wanted to sell the very land that they were living on. You see, the Donnellys actually were squatting on that land. They didn't purchase it, but again, no one was living there, and for 10 years, no one bothered them. So, when the owner wanted to sell the land, the Donnellys took them to court, and actually, in a shocking decision, the judge ruled in favor of the Donnellys. The judge recognized the hard work that the family had put into the land, the life that they had built for themselves there, and he granted them approximately 50 acres, or equivalent of half of the total property. Now, the Donnellys' neighbor, Patrick Farrell, he did not like this. That land was meant to be his. And so over the next few months, tempers were high. James and his neighbor Patrick did not like each other. And it all came out at a barn raising one night. Now, if you were born in the last 35 years like me, you probably don't know what a barn raising is. It's the equivalent of having your buddies come over, giving them pizza and beer, and asking them to help you move. Except instead of moving, they're literally building a barn. So at this barn raising, it's rumored that tempers were flying, people were drinking. Allegedly, Patrick had been hitting the sauce pretty hard. James, not so much. But tempers rose. These two guys were in a small space, alcohol's involved, classic Irish tale as old as time. And they ended up getting in a fist fight. A fist fight between 2 consenting adults, that's one thing, right? But it's alleged that somewhere during the fight, James Donnelly, he picked up a wooden handspike. Now, you can picture just a big piece of wood. Sometimes it's got an iron spike on the end. Typically, they use it on ships to move cannonballs, and it's just a very heavy tool. Anyways, it's alleged that James picked up this handspike and, like a baseball bat, whacked Patrick in the head. Patrick was immediately dead, and James was officially on the run. Now, if you live in, anywhere that has winter, basically, you know that a place like Canada in the winter can be a very unforgiving climate. So this was in June or July that this initial fight happened, and winter was coming up in just a few short months. Now, James didn't run far. People would recall seeing a strange woman working the land. Most people believe that was probably James in his wife's clothes, just, continuing to work. But he couldn't live at the house full time. People were looking for him. In fact, a lot of the people in the town were really unhappy with the way that he had killed Patrick, and they wanted revenge. So surprisingly, James did make it through the winter. There were sympathizers in town with him as well, so he would stay with them. He would go home sometimes. But ultimately, it wasn't the life that he wanted. Because once the winter started coming around again, I think he was just dreading the idea. And for over a year, just watching your family from afar, not really being able to participate in their lives, that's a torture all on its own. So James turned himself in. Now, initially, he was found guilty of murder, and he was ordered to hang. Now, Johanna, James' wife, she heard this, and, she took action right away. She submitted an appeal, basically, saying that her husband, James, killed that man, yeah, true, but it was self-defense. And it worked, actually. Instead of it being executed, James was now only sentenced to 7 years in the Kingston Penitentiary. And he served every single day. James Donnelly served all 7 years in Kingston Penitentiary and walked out a free man. When he returned home, though, he realized the township had not forgotten or forgiven what happened in that barn. By the time he was released, the Donnellys weren't just a family anymore. They were a symbol of defiance, resistance, of Irish Catholic stubbornness. James and Joanna, well, they had sons growing up in that poison environment, 7 total. And those boys learned very early that if they didn't stand up for themselves, no one would. So the Donnelly boys, well, they grew up as fighters. They would get into tavern brawls, arguments with neighbors, fist fights, property disputes, lawsuits, counter lawsuits. It was really like this tit for tat thing. No one really knows who started anything at this point. When your name is already cursed, it doesn't take much to keep that narrative going. And so I'm not saying the Donnelly boys were angels, but the town was not innocent in this either. Back then, in this era, law wasn't about courtrooms. It was about majority force. Who had the bigger stick type of thing. So the Donnelly haters, they organized, and they formed something called the Vigilance Committee. This was not a book club. It actually started as a peace society, designed as a group of people who wanted to keep the peace, but quickly escalated into a private, self-appointed law enforcement group, made up of men who believed that if the courts would not punish the Donnellys, then they would. Now, some members claimed they were just trying to keep the peace. Others were a lot more honest about their intentions. They wanted to destroy the Donnelly family, piece by any means necessary. And this committee, this militia, would be the exact weapon used to carry out what would eventually become the most famous massacre in Canadian history. But first, the violence had to escalate. And it would. In 1875, something happened that would turn this feud into an unstoppable wildfire. By the mid-1870s, the Donnellys weren't just farmers or fighters anymore. They were businessmen. They ran their own stagecoach line, transporting passengers between towns. That put them in direct competition with another powerful local family, the Flanagans. In the 1800s, stagecoach routes were the equivalent of today's transit contracts. Whoever controlled the road controlled the money. And the Donnellys and Flanagans hated the idea of splitting anything, especially with each other. So the rivalry got physical. Drivers would race each other down narrow country roads, trying to arrive first at taverns and depots to grab the customers. There are reports of drivers ramming wheels, swerving into each other, even cracking whips across the rival horses. Then one day, a Flanagan driver lost control and died after a collision. The Donnellys were immediately blamed. Evidence pointed to maybe just a loose wheel, but there was really no trial, no damning evidence, just a dead man and one more reason to hate the Donnellys. So the Flanagans retaliated. One of their drivers tried to run a Donnelly stagecoach into a ditch, almost killing him. And these weren't accidents. This was economic warfare with reins and horses and iron wheels. Every collision, every crash, every injury just poured more fuel onto the fire. The Vigilance Committee absorbed this energy. This is exactly what they needed. It wasn't just punish the Donnellys for old violence. Now it was they're criminals and they're ruining honest men's livelihood. So this stagecoach war didn't resolve the feud. It escalated it beyond control. And when words and lawsuits and roadside collisions weren't enough anymore, the fire next time wouldn't be metaphorical. It would be very, very real. By the mid-1870s, the Donnelly name wasn't just a problem, it was a lightning rod. People literally blamed them for everything. Missing livestock? Donnellys. Broken fence? Donnellys. Argument in a tavern? Probably a Donnelly started it. The truth is, some of those accusations were lies, and some of them were true. Some of the retaliations stacked on retaliations until nobody even remembered who started what. And then, literally, the fires started. Barns were being burned in the night, stables torched, tools gone missing and found melted in the ashes the next morning. It wasn't just one event, it was a pattern. People accused the Donnellys accused others, and then the police got involved. Trials happened, perjury was literally everywhere. Nobody knew who struck the first match, but everybody knew where this was heading. Because in the 1800s, when you burn a man's barn, that is not vandalism. That is the destruction of his entire livelihood. And in a place where men settle scores themselves, fire does not end a fight. It escalates it. The Vigilance Committee now had the perfect justification. The family is out of control, they'd say, and the law can't stop them. And that idea repeated, whispered, agreed upon, over kitchen tables, tavern counters, it slowly shifted from an opinion to a plan. The Vigilance Committee became something darker. Less neighborhood watch and more execution squad. And all that rage and all that fear would finally explode on one February night, the night the Donnelly family was wiped out. February 4th, 1880. The Vigilance Committee gathered after dark. They drank, they spoke in low voices, and they agreed on a single outcome. Tonight, they would say, the Donnelly problem ends. Just after midnight, dozens of men approached the Donnelly homestead. They carried clubs, axes, and torches. 35 men total. They surrounded the home like wolves surrounding a wounded deer. Inside the house that night were James Donnelly and his wife Johanna, who were both in their 60s, their son Tom, and cousin Bridget. Also visiting was a young farmhand named Johnny O'Connor. He was 13 and he was sleeping upstairs. James Carroll, the self-appointed constable, or the leader of the Vigilance Committee, was the first to enter the house that night. He struck a match, quietly slapped a pair of handcuffs on Tom, and ordered the rest of the family into the living room. After that, he let out a yell, which prompted the rest of the mob to enter the house. They began beating the family, not discriminating between women, men, or children. Tom Donnelly made a run for the front yard, but was shortly caught and beat to death. The Donnellys didn't stand a chance. James Donnelly, who was now 64 and had survived starvation, prison, 20 years of conflict, died on his own kitchen floor. Johanna died defending him, and Tom was beaten so severely that his skull shattered. Their bodies were left in the home, and the log cabin was set ablaze to destroy the evidence. The mob then moved down the road in search of another son, William Donnelly, intending to kill him too. The mob started torturing William's horse in an attempt to lure him outside, but he wasn't home that night. Instead, his younger brother John went to the front door with a lantern, and a member of the mob, mistaking John for his older brother William, used his shotgun to shoot through the door, killing John Donnelly. By sunrise, 2 Donnelly homes had been attacked. Several members of the family were dead. And the township, in the twisted logic of mob justice, finally believed the feud was resolved. Except it wasn't. There was one detail that the killers did not expect. Johnny O'Connor, the 13-year-old farmhand, he survived. When they lit the house on fire, he ran away through the smoke after hiding under a bed. He had watched the murders through the cracks in the floorboards and would become the key witness in the trials that followed. But here's the most disturbing part. Nobody was ever convicted. 6 men stood trial with witness testimony from Johnny O'Connor. He was discredited due to his age, being again only 13 at the time. Not a single member of the mob spent a day in prison. In that township, the same hatred that killed the Donnellys protected their killers. To this day in Canadian history, it stands as one of the greatest failures of justice. We talk about the Donnellys like they're folklore, like they're freaky stories, some old legend that happened to a friend of a friend. But they were real people killed by neighbors. People who went home afterwards took off their boots, sat down at their tables, and carried on with their lives. If you want more true dark stories like this, mysteries, massacres, conspiracies, the kind of stories people try to avoid, subscribe, because we've got more to tell. Next up, if you want another unbelievable true story, watch my episode on Michael Malloy, an Irish immigrant in New York targeted in an insurance scam who refused to die. They called him the man who wouldn't die, and I'll see you over there. Thanks for watching.